went to Hollywood, and there was a theater. I looked at the marquee.
Every little town here, Longview, man, you name it, I've been there.
Elvis. I once visited Hollywood and stopped in front of a theater, staring up at the marquee, thinking about how many stories were hidden behind those bright lights. From small towns to famous cities, every place holds a memory, and few stories from Hollywood's golden era are as fascinating as the connection between Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret. Even decades later, their story still sparks curiosity, emotion, and endless discussion. While Elvis was linked to several women throughout his life, his bond with Ann-Margret stood apart. She wasn't just another co-star or passing presence. What they shared was powerful, intense, and deeply personal, even if much of it remained unspoken. Ann-Margret first met Elvis Presley in July of 1963 at the MGM soundstage at Radio Recorders Studios in Hollywood while preparing to film Viva Las Vegas. They were introduced by director George Sidney, and from the moment they shook hands, something clicked. Their humor, energy, and natural ease around each other created an instant connection. Ann-Margret later recalled feeling calm when meeting Elvis, despite his enormous fame. She had no idea that the man adored by millions would soon capture her heart as well. Their early interactions were professional. They took a few publicity photos and went their separate ways, only to reunite days later to rehearse musical numbers for the film. During those duets, everything changed. They found themselves completely in sync, moving and performing as if they had done it together all their lives. Music wasn't just something they performed, it was something they felt deeply. When they danced, their movements mirrored each other naturally, as if guided by the same rhythm. On stage, they weren't simply performers, they were alive, expressive, and completely immersed. Beyond the screen, they discovered how much they had in common. Both came from humble beginnings, both valued privacy, family, and faith, and both preferred late nights filled with long conversations. They shared a love for motorcycles, laughter, and quiet moments away from crowds. As filming moved to Las Vegas, their bond grew stronger. Elvis stayed at the Sahara Hotel surrounded by close friends, while Ann-Margret stayed a few floors below. She brought an energy that few could match, and Elvis was the only co-star who could truly keep up with her. Their chemistry wasn't staged. It was real. What began as friendly outings soon turned into private moments away from everyone else. They would escape into the hills at night, gazing over the city lights or looking up at the stars, sharing dreams, fears, and thoughts Elvis rarely revealed to anyone. People around them noticed. They spent time together between scenes, shared meals away from others, and grew visibly closer. Ann-Margret became one of the most important people in Elvis's life outside of his family. While working together, professional tensions surfaced when Elvis felt the spotlight shifting toward Ann-Margret during filming. His frustration was addressed behind the scenes, but it never damaged their personal bond. By then, their connection had grown into something much deeper. Those close to Elvis later said this was not a passing romance. It was intense, emotional, and meaningful. They cared deeply for one another, and for a time, they continued seeing each other even after filming ended. However, back in Memphis, another person was waiting. Elvis was still committed to Priscilla, and as news stories and photos emerged, the situation became more complicated. Reassurances over the phone weren't enough to ease the tension. Pressure from family and management mounted, forcing Elvis into an impossible decision. When Ann-Margret openly acknowledged their relationship during a public appearance overseas, media speculation exploded, making matters even more difficult. Soon after, communication between them faded. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no reply. Ann-Margret tried to understand, knowing the weight of expectations on Elvis's shoulders. They saw each other occasionally, but both knew the relationship couldn't continue. Elvis chose to honor his commitment, and their story quietly came to an end. In 1967, Elvis married Priscilla, and shortly afterward, Ann-Margret married Roger Smith. Though their paths changed, the respect and care between Elvis and Ann-Margret never disappeared. Years later, they reunited as friends, supporting each other's work and attending each other's performances whenever possible. Elvis continued sending her flowers on opening nights, a tradition that lasted for years. As time passed, both faced personal challenges, each in their own way. When news of Elvis's passing reached Ann-Margret in 1977, she was deeply affected. She attended his farewell at Graceland and was welcomed by his family with warmth and respect. His father later told her how proud Elvis had been of her and how much she had meant to him. Ann-Margret went on to honor his legacy, participating in tributes and speaking about him with admiration and understanding. Even today, she defends his artistry and humanity, reminding the world that behind the legend was a man with dreams, struggles, and a deep capacity for love. Their story remains one of Hollywood's most unforgettable connections. It raises a question many still wonder about. If life had taken a different turn, could things have changed for Elvis? We'll never know, but what's certain is that what Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret shared was real, meaningful, and left a lasting mark on both of their lives. As the years moved forward, the connection between Ann-Margret and Elvis Presley didn't fade the way most Hollywood stories do. Even though their paths had separated publicly, the emotional imprint they left on each other remained quietly present. Life carried them in different directions, yet echoes of what they once shared continued to surface in subtle ways, through gestures, memories, and moments that never reached the headlines. Elvis stepped fully into his role as a husband and later a father, trying to balance personal responsibilities with a career that demanded more from him than almost any artist before or since. Fame followed him everywhere, and expectations weighed heavily on his shoulders. Ann-Margret, meanwhile, poured herself into her work, building a career defined by versatility, discipline, and remarkable resilience. She became known not only for her talent but for her professionalism, warmth, and determination to evolve beyond the image that first made her famous. Though they no longer spoke regularly, those who were close to Elvis noticed that Ann-Margret's name still carried meaning for him. He never spoke poorly of her, never dismissed what they had shared, and never treated their past as something trivial. To him, that chapter of his life had been genuine, and it stayed that way in his heart. For Ann-Margret, the memory of Elvis was equally complex. It was filled with admiration, affection, and an understanding that some connections are powerful precisely because they are brief. As Elvis returned to live performances and began reshaping his public image, Ann-Margret watched from a distance, proud of his achievements and aware of the pressures surrounding him. She understood the demands of fame and how easily it could isolate someone, even when surrounded by people. Their mutual understanding was something few others shared, because few others had lived inside that same whirlwind. Throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, they crossed paths occasionally, often backstage at shows in Las Vegas. These reunions were respectful, warm, and free of bitterness. They spoke as people who had grown, learned, and accepted what life had given them. There were smiles, shared memories, and a quiet acknowledgement of what had once been, without any attempt to reopen old doors. Elvis continued sending flowers to Ann-Margret on her opening nights, a simple yet meaningful tradition that spoke volumes. It wasn't about romance anymore. It was about respect, encouragement, and a bond forged during a pivotal time in both of their lives. Ann-Margret appreciated the gesture not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of mutual support between two artists who truly understood one another. Behind the scenes, Elvis faced growing challenges. The pressure of constant touring, the weight of expectations, and years of pushing himself without rest began to take their toll. Those close to him noticed changes in his energy and spirit. Ann-Margret, hearing occasional updates through mutual friends, expressed concern and asked about his well-being whenever she could. Her concern wasn't fueled by nostalgia, but by genuine care for someone who had once meant so much to her. When the news of Elvis's passing reached Ann-Margret in 1977, it came as a profound shock. Despite the distance between them in recent years, the loss felt deeply personal. She chose to attend his farewell at Graceland, despite being advised otherwise. Her presence was met not with discomfort, but with warmth and acceptance. The Presley family welcomed her, recognizing the important role she had played in Elvis's life. In a private moment, Elvis's father held her hands and spoke words that stayed with her forever. He told her that his son truly loved her and that he had always been proud of who she was and what she became. For Ann-Margret, those words brought both comfort and sorrow, affirming what she had always known while also closing a chapter that had never fully left her heart. In the months that followed, she was asked to host a tribute honoring Elvis's life and legacy. Accepting the role was not easy. Speaking about him publicly required strength and composure, as memories resurfaced with every word. Yet she approached the tribute with grace, focusing on his talent, his kindness, and the joy he brought to millions around the world. As the years passed, Ann-Margret continued to speak about Elvis with honesty and compassion. She never sensationalized their story, never exaggerated it for attention, and never allowed it to define her entirely. Instead, she acknowledged it as a meaningful part of her journey, one that shaped her understanding of love, connection, and timing. Their story has often been framed as a question of what might have been. Could things have turned out differently if circumstances had changed? Could Elvis have found a different path? Ann-Margret herself has never claimed to have the answers. She understood that life is shaped by countless forces beyond personal feelings alone, including responsibility, pressure, and choices made under extraordinary circumstances. What makes their story endure isn't the idea of lost romance, but the respect and kindness that remained long after the romance ended. In an industry known for fleeting connections, they stood apart because it was rooted in shared passion, mutual understanding, and genuine affection. Ann-Margret went on to enjoy a long and celebrated career, earning recognition for her performances across film, television, and live stage. She faced personal challenges with courage and emerged stronger, becoming an example of resilience and grace. Her marriage to Roger Smith provided stability, partnership, and support, allowing her to continue growing both personally and professionally. Even decades later, when asked about Elvis, Ann-Margret speaks with warmth rather than regret. She emphasizes his humanity, his generosity, and the joy he found in music. She reminds people that behind the legend was a man who laughed easily, cared deeply, and felt things intensely. Elvis Presley's legacy continues to influence generations of artists, musicians, and fans around the world. His impact on culture is undeniable, but so is the importance of remembering him as more than an icon. Those who knew him best understood that he was shaped by love, loyalty, and the constant challenge of balancing personal happiness with public expectation. The story of Elvis and Ann-Margret remains one of Hollywood's most compelling narratives, not because it ended, but because of how it was handled. There was no public bitterness, no lasting resentment, and no attempt to rewrite history. Instead, there was acceptance, respect, and a shared understanding that some connections exist to teach us something important, even if they are not meant to last forever. Looking back, it becomes clear that their bond wasn't about saving or changing one another. It was about recognition. They saw each other clearly during a moment when both needed to be seen, understood, and appreciated without conditions. That kind of connection leaves a mark, regardless of how long it lasts. Today, Ann-Margret remains a respected figure in entertainment, admired not only for her talent but for her integrity and strength. Elvis Presley remains a cultural force whose music continues to inspire and move people across generations. Together, their story lives on as a reminder that even in the brightest spotlight, some of the most meaningful moments happen quietly, away from the crowd. And so, when people ask what might have happened if life had unfolded differently, perhaps the better question is what did happen. Two extraordinary individuals met at the right moment, shared something real, and carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. In the end, that may be more meaningful than any alternate ending we could imagine. Personal chapter into a cultural memory. What once belonged only to them became something larger, interpreted, debated, and revisited by fans, historians, and storytellers who searched for meaning behind one of Hollywood's most talked-about connections. Yet despite all the speculation, the truth remained surprisingly simple. Two people met at a unique moment in their lives, shared something sincere, and carried that experience with them in quiet, lasting ways. For Ann-Margret, the years following Elvis's passing were filled with reflection but not regret. She never positioned herself as a figure from his past seeking recognition. Instead, she focused on her own path, her work, and the values that had guided her since the beginning of her career. She understood that being part of Elvis's story did not mean living inside it. Her identity was never defined by one relationship, no matter how meaningful it had been. She continued performing, appearing on screen, and taking on projects that challenged her creatively. Audiences admired her not only for her talent, but for her authenticity. There was a grounded quality about her that stood in contrast to the larger-than-life image often associated with Hollywood legends. She spoke openly about growth, discipline, and the importance of staying true to oneself in an industry that often pressures people to become something they are not. Whenever Elvis's name surfaced in interviews, Ann-Margret responded with thoughtfulness and care. She never reduced him to headlines or myths. She spoke about his generosity, his humor, and his dedication to music. She reminded people that fame magnifies both strengths and struggles, and that compassion matters more than judgment. Her words helped shape a more balanced understanding of who Elvis was beyond the stage. Over time, their story became an example of how meaningful connections don't always follow traditional paths. Not every important relationship ends in permanence, and not every lasting impact comes from staying together. Sometimes, the most influential people in our lives are those who walk beside us for a short distance, changing us in ways we don't fully understand until much later. Elvis's influence, meanwhile, continued to grow even after his passing. New generations discovered his music, his performances, and his unique ability to connect emotionally through sound and movement. His work transcended time, finding relevance far beyond the era in which it was created. Museums, tributes, documentaries, and academic studies all contributed to preserving his legacy as both an innovator and a symbol of cultural change. Within those narratives, Ann-Margret's presence was often mentioned not as a footnote, but as a significant part of a formative period in Elvis's life. Their collaboration on Viva Las Vegas remained one of the most celebrated pairings in film history, not just because of the music or choreography, but because audiences could sense something genuine between them. That authenticity continues to resonate, even decades later. What makes their story especially compelling is the absence of resentment. There were no public disputes, no attempts to rewrite history, and no desire to place blame. Both accepted the choices that were made and the circumstances that shaped them. That acceptance allowed their connection to mature into something rare in Hollywood stories, mutual respect that endured. Friends who knew them both often described their bond as one built on understanding rather than possession. They recognized each other as individuals with ambitions, responsibilities, and pressures that extended far beyond romance. That understanding may be why their connection remained intact emotionally, even after life pulled them in different directions. As Ann-Margret grew older, she became increasingly selective about the stories she chose to share. She understood the power of words and the responsibility that came with being associated with a figure as iconic as Elvis. When she spoke, she did so with intention, offering insight rather than spectacle. Her reflections added depth to the broader narrative surrounding Elvis, reminding people that legends are still human beings shaped by relationships, choices, and moments of vulnerability. The enduring fascination with their story also reveals something about audiences themselves. People are drawn to stories that feel honest, that reflect real emotional complexity rather than perfect endings. The relationship between Elvis and Ann-Margret resonates because it mirrors life as it truly is, full of connection, conflict, timing, and decisions that don't always align with our deepest feelings. In many ways, their story challenges the idea that love must always lead to permanence to be meaningful. What they shared mattered because it existed, not because of how it ended. It shaped their lives, influenced their work, and left a quiet imprint that lasted far longer than the time they spent together. As the years continue to pass, Ann-Margret remains a living link to a pivotal era in entertainment history. Her presence serves as a reminder of a time when artistry, performance, and emotional expression converged in powerful ways. She carries that history with grace, never clinging to the past, but never dismissing it either. Elvis Presley's legacy continues to evolve as well. Each generation finds something new in his music, whether it's energy, comfort, nostalgia, or inspiration. His ability to connect across time speaks to the universality of emotion and the power of artistic expression. Behind that legacy are stories like his connection with Ann-Margret, stories that add dimension and humanity to the legend. In the end, their story is not about missed chances or alternate outcomes. It is about presence. It is about what happens when two people truly see each other during a moment of shared passion and understanding. It is about carrying that experience forward with respect, gratitude, and dignity. their connection did not need to last forever to matter forever. It lived on in music, in memory, and in the quiet ways they honored each other throughout their lives. And perhaps that is why their story continues to captivate, because it reminds us that some of the most important chapters in our lives are not defined by how long they last, but by how deeply they shape us.